Leonard Chess fled the poverty of European slums only to build a multi-million-dollar music empire on the backs of black artists fleeing the Jim Crow South. He couldn't play a single note, yet he became the supreme architect of Chicago blues by acting as a benevolent godfather to vulnerable musicians. But his legendary generosity was actually a weaponized financial trap. He handed out gleaming Cadillacs and pocket cash to illiterate artists, using phantom debts to quietly steal the publishing rights to songs that built rock and roll. This is the brutal paradox of Chess Records, the story of a man who was simultaneously the greatest savior of a marginalized culture and its most ruthless parasite. Leonard Chess did not grow up in the pristine suburbs of a booming America. The family settled in a neighborhood where the air smelled of slaughterhouses and burning coal. His father opened a small junkyard. This was Leonard's first education in American economics. He learned to strip scrap metal, to negotiate for pennies, and to find value in the things the rest of the city had discarded. The scrapyard taught him ruthless pragmatism. It also placed him at ground zero of a profound demographic collision. The South Side of Chicago was not just a landing pad for European immigrants. It was the terminus of the Great Migration. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Black Americans were fleeing the systemic terror of the Jim Crow South. They were running from lynch mobs, sharecropping debt traps, and total disenfranchisement. They packed their lives into suitcases and boarded trains heading north, searching for industrial jobs and basic human dignity. What they found in Chicago was a different, more sophisticated kind of cage. Through the insidious practice of redlining, the city's banks and government forced the incoming black population into heavily segregated, overcrowded strips of land. They were trapped in slums with exorbitant rents and brutal policing. This is the exact crucible where Leonard Chess was forged. He grew up shoulder to shoulder with the black working class. Unlike the wealthy white executives sitting in the boardrooms of major record labels in New York, Leonard did not look at the black residents of the South Side with patrician disdain or anthropological curiosity. He looked at them as his neighbors. More importantly, he looked at them as a market. The white establishment ignored this demographic entirely, deeming their culture primitive and unmarketable. Leonard, possessing the sharp instincts of a refugee who understood what it meant to be locked out of the mainstream, saw a massive untapped economy. By the time the Second World War ended, Leonard had scraped together enough money from the junkyard and various street-level hustles to buy a liquor store. The liquor business in a segregated neighborhood required a specific set of survival skills. It required knowing how to handle local gangs, how to bribe the right beat cops, and how to operate in the gray margins of the law. Leonard excelled at this. He understood that in a system designed to fail its residents, a man with cash could become his own authority. He was already developing the paternalistic fixer mentality that would later define his record empire. He was the white man who could get things done in a black neighborhood, a dynamic built on a foundation of deep systemic inequality. In 1946, Leonard and Phil took their liquor profits and bought a nightclub. They called it the Macamba Lounge, located on South Cottage Grove Avenue. It was not a polished, high-society jazz club. It was a rough, vibrant, smoke-filled room that stayed open until 4 in the morning. It catered to the black factory workers, the hustlers, and the recent arrivals from the Mississippi Delta. The Macamba was notorious for prostitution and illegal gambling, but its primary commodity was noise. Standing behind the bar, wiping down the counter, Leonard Chess listened. The music echoing off the walls of his club was not the smooth, orchestrated jazz of Duke Ellington or Count Basie. This music was harsh. It sounded like the steel mills where his patrons worked. It was played by men who had grown up sweating in cotton fields. Because the clubs in Chicago were loud and crowded, these musicians had recently begun plugging their cheap acoustic guitars into crude amplifiers just to be heard over the shouting and the clinking glasses. The result was a loud, distorted, violently alive sound. It was the embryonic pulse of electrified Chicago blues. Leonard did not understand the music on a technical level. He could not play an instrument. He did not inherently relate to the deep, historical agony of the blues. But he possessed a brilliant, predatory intuition for human reaction. He watched the way his patrons moved. He watched the way they drank more when the tempo sped up. He watched the way a wailing harmonica line could make a room full of exhausted, marginalized workers erupt into a frenzy. He realized that this music was a direct line to the nervous system of his customers. It was the sound of their trauma, their survival, and their weekend release. The major record labels of the era, Columbia, RCA, Decca, were completely blind to this. They controlled the distribution networks and the radio stations, and they catered almost exclusively to the sanitized tastes of white middle-class America. If they recorded black artists at all, it was strictly sophisticated pop or jazz. The raw, screaming Delta sound was considered culturally worthless. Leonard saw the vacuum. The people packing the Macamba Lounge had money in their pockets from the post-war industrial boom, but no one was selling them their own culture. The music industry's systemic racism had created a massive blind spot, and Leonard Chess decided to step directly into it. Leonard realized that selling drinks was a finite hustle. A nightclub could only hold a few hundred people a night, and the overheads, bribing the vice squad, paying bartenders, replacing broken furniture, were constant. Selling the sound of the bar on a piece of shellac, however, offered infinite scale. A record was just a piece of cheap shellac stamped with a groove. It cost pennies to manufacture, could be sold for 79 cents, and could be in 1,000 places at once. He did not yet know the mechanics of pressing a record or the legalities of copyright law, but he recognized that the heavy, electrifying noise vibrating through the floorboards of the Macamba Lounge was a raw material waiting to be refined, packaged, and monetized. Acting on this predatory business instinct, Leonard took the survival skills forged in the Chicago scrapyards and bought a stake in Aristocrat Records in 1947, a struggling independent label founded by Evelyn Aron and her husband. Aristocrat was floundering. They were attempting to record polished jazz and polite pop music, trying to compete with the major corporate labels on their own terms. It was a losing battle. Leonard, bringing his abrasive street sensibilities into the cramped office, quickly realized that mimicking the white establishment was a fool's errand. The major labels owned the pressing plants and the national distribution networks. To survive, Aristocrat needed a monopoly on a demographic that the majors completely ignored. The collision that birthed the modern music industry walked through the doors of Aristocrat Records in 1948. His name was McKinley Morganfield, though the streets of the South Side knew him as Muddy Waters. Muddy was the antithesis of the polished jazz musicians Aristocrat had been failing to sell. He had grown up on the Stovall plantation in the Mississippi Delta, driving a tractor and playing a crude acoustic guitar. He carried the deep generational trauma of the Jim Crow South in the very timbre of his voice, a heavy, booming moan that sounded like dirt and blood. When he arrived in Chicago, he found that the acoustic guitars of the Delta were drowned out by the roar of the elevated trains and the clamor of the crowded taverns. So he bought an electric guitar, turned the amplifier up until the speaker cone rattled, and played the ancient Delta blues with a violent industrial aggression. When Muddy Waters sat in the studio and recorded a track called I Can't Be Satisfied, Leonard Chess stood in the control room, thoroughly appalled. To Leonard, a man who had spent his entire life trying to scrub the dirt of poverty off his hands, the sound emanating from the studio floor was deeply offensive. It was unrefined, abrasive, and entirely lacking in the sophistication he associated with success. "What the hell is he saying?" Leonard demanded, pacing the floor. "Who is going to buy this country garbage?" Leonard's reaction was rooted in the classic immigrant paradox. Having worked desperately to assimilate into mainstream American capitalism, he viewed the raw, unassimilated culture of the rural Black South as a regression. He did not understand the profound emotional weight of the music. He only heard noise. It was Evelyn Aron who recognized the raw power of the recording and fought to release it. Reluctantly, treating it as an expendable gamble, Leonard authorized the pressing of 3,000 copies of the single. The morning the record was delivered to the shops on the South Side, a phenomenon occurred that completely shattered Leonard's understanding of the market. Within hours, the entire stock vanished. People were lining up outside record stores, demanding the single. Muddy himself had a limit placed on him, only permitted to buy 2 copies because the distributors were entirely cleaned out. The record sold out in half a day. The commercial riot sparked by I Can't Be Satisfied was deeply rooted in the psychology of its audience. The Black residents of Chicago in 1948 were largely refugees of the Great Migration. They had fled the physical violence of the South, but they were now enduring the psychological violence of the North. They were freezing in unheated tenements, working brutally dangerous jobs in the meatpacking plants, and facing a deeply entrenched system of redlining that kept them segregated. They were physically displaced and emotionally unmoored. When they heard Muddy Waters' amplified slide guitar cutting through the static of a record player, they did not just hear a song, they heard a cultural tether. It was the sound of the home they had bled for, weaponized and modernized for the concrete city. It was an auditory validation of their existence. Leonard Chess watched the cash roll in and experienced an immediate paradigm shift. Aesthetics, taste, and musical theory were entirely irrelevant. Demand was the only truth. He didn't need to understand the soul of the blues. He only needed to understand how to press it onto a disc and get it to the people who were starving for it. By 1950, Evelyn Aron had left the company. Leonard brought his brother, Phil, into the business. They bought out the remaining partners, dissolved Aristocrat, and officially renamed the company Chess Records. The brothers established a division of labor. Phil managed the chaotic environment of the recording studio and the administrative headquarters, while Leonard took on the monumental task of distribution. The distribution of independent black music in the early 1950s was not a matter of making polite phone calls to corporate buyers. It was a physical, dangerous, and highly corrupt enterprise. Leonard loaded the oversized boot of his Cadillac with stacks of heavy, brittle 78 RPM shellac records and drove out of Chicago, heading deep into the fiercely segregated heart of the American South. Picture the reality of this operation. Here was a Polish-Jewish immigrant, speaking with a harsh Chicago accent, driving a luxury car through Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. He was navigating a territory effectively controlled by the Ku Klux Klan and violently racist sheriffs entirely alone. His cargo was a product created by black men, destined for black consumers. Yet, because of the rigid structures of Jim Crow, the infrastructure required to sell that product, the radio stations, the distribution warehouses, the larger record stores, was almost entirely owned by white men. To bypass this systemic blockade, Leonard deployed the most effective weapon in the history of American capitalism, cash. He pulled up to radio stations in the dead of night. He walked into the broadcasting booths of the few white DJs who were willing to play race records late in the evening. He did not ask for favors. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a wad of $100 bills, and handed them directly to the DJs. This practice, known as payola, would later be heavily criminalized and framed by the federal government as a moral corruption of the youth. But in the context of the 1950s, for an independent label selling black music, payola was not a moral failing. It was a necessary siege tactic. The major corporate labels controlled the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, and the mainstream airwaves. They had a vested interest in keeping the raw, sexualized, and aggressive sound of the blues off the radio. If Leonard Chess had played by the legal rules of the white corporate establishment, Muddy Waters would have never been heard outside of a 3-block radius in Chicago. Payola was the crowbar Leonard used to pry open a closed, racist monopoly. He bought the airtime. He bought the hit records. He learned exactly which DJs to bribe, which jukebox operators to take out for expensive steak dinners, and which local distributors needed a cut of the profits to prioritize his records over the competition. As Leonard established this ruthless, underground distribution network, he realized another fundamental business truth. He could not build an empire entirely reliant on unpredictable, chaotic street musicians walking into his studio off the pavement. If Chess Records was going to scale, it needed to evolve from a hustle into a factory. He needed a consistent, recognizable product. He needed a brand standard. He found the architect for this standard in a man named Willie Dixon. Willie Dixon was a giant of a man, a former Golden Gloves boxer who had served time in prison for refusing the military draft, citing systemic racism as his reason for not fighting for America. But behind his intimidating physical presence was a brilliant, highly organized musical mind. Unlike Muddy Waters or the other Delta migrants who played entirely by instinct and feeling, Dixon understood music theory. He understood song structure, arrangement, and timing. Leonard Chess, acutely aware of his own musical ignorance, hired Dixon to be the engine room of Chess Records. Dixon became the musical director, the in-house songwriter, the session bassist, and the primary arranger. It was a brilliant, exploitative move. Leonard paid Dixon a modest salary to manage the chaos of the studio floor, effectively outsourcing the creation of the product. Together at the newly established studio at 2120 South Michigan Avenue, they engineered what would become globally recognized as the Chess sound. Leonard demanded records that would cut through the ambient noise of a crowded, noisy juke joint. To achieve this, Dixon and the Chess brothers pushed the drums to the absolute front of the mix, utilizing the heavy, driving backbeat of session drummer Fred Below. They thickened the bottom end with Dixon's upright bass. But the defining characteristic of the Chess sound came through the volatile genius of a young harmonica player named Marion Jacobs, known as Little Walter. Little Walter took a cheap microphone, cupped it tightly in his hands along with his harmonica, and plugged it directly into a guitar amplifier. He pushed the volume until the tubes in the amp were pushed beyond their limits, creating a thick, screeching, distorted wail. It sounded like a saxophone being pushed through a meat grinder. It was dangerous, modern, and entirely unprecedented. When Little Walter recorded Juke in 1952, it became a massive instrumental hit. The Chess sound was solidified. It was an audio assault, calculated and compressed, designed to grab the listener by the throat within the first 3 seconds of the needle hitting the groove. Leonard Chess now had his factory running perfectly. He had the raw material arriving daily from the South. He had Willie Dixon refining that material into 3-minute commercial products. And he had his Cadillac network, bribing and strong-arming the records onto the airwaves. The money began to flow not just in thousands, but in millions. Yet, as the empire expanded, the fundamental architecture of Leonard's business model began to reveal its deeply sinister nature. He was manufacturing million-dollar assets, but the men providing the labor, the men bleeding their souls into the microphones at 2120 South Michigan Avenue, were not being treated as partners or even as legal employees. They were being absorbed into a financial ecosystem designed entirely to strip them of their wealth before they even realized they had earned it. The machinery of the Godfather was fully operational, and the trap was set. The door to Leonard Chess's office at 2120 South Michigan Avenue was almost always open, and the drawer of his heavy wooden desk was almost always unlocked. Inside that drawer sat a thick, rubber-banded roll of $100 bills. This roll of cash was not a petty cash fund for office supplies. It was the central operating mechanism of the Chess Records empire. It was the tool Leonard used to build a sophisticated, highly effective system of paternalistic exploitation, a system designed to keep his artists entirely dependent, perpetually indebted, and relentlessly productive. Analyzing Leonard Chess's control over his legendary roster requires stripping away the modern concept of a corporate record label. There were no human resources departments, no standardized royalty statements sent out in the post, and no formal legal negotiations between equals. The men recording for Chess, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, Sonny Boy Williamson did not have entertainment lawyers reviewing their contracts. Most of them had only a rudimentary education. Many were functionally illiterate. They had spent their formative years navigating the brutal, life-threatening racial hierarchy of the American South. When these musicians arrived in Chicago, they carried the trauma of that environment with them. They did not trust white institutions. They did not trust banks. They did not trust the police, and they certainly did not trust the courts. The formal, legalistic world of white American capitalism was a weapon that had historically been used to crush them. Leonard Chess understood this profound psychological vulnerability perfectly. He realized that to control these men, he could not act like a corporate executive in a glass tower. He had to act like a street-level boss. He had to become the Godfather. Leonard positioned himself as the sole buffer between his black artists and a hostile white society. He cultivated an environment that felt less like a business partnership and more like a deeply dysfunctional family, with himself sitting firmly at the head of the table. If a musician's wife was sick, Leonard paid the hospital bill in cash. If an artist fell behind on their rent and was facing eviction, Leonard covered the landlord's fee. If a session player was arrested for public intoxication or a bar fight, Leonard would drive down to the local precinct in the middle of the night, peel a few bills from his roll to bribe the desk sergeant, and walk the musician out the front door. To the artists, this felt like salvation. They had never encountered a white man with power who was willing to come down into the gutters to pull them out of trouble. They viewed Leonard with a fierce, protective loyalty. But this benevolence was a calculated illusion. It was an urbanization of a financial trap they had supposedly left behind in Mississippi. The artists of Chess Records had fled the Southern sharecropping system, an economic architecture designed to ensure that the black farmer never achieved financial independence. In sharecropping, the white plantation owner provided the seeds, the tools, and the housing. The black farmer provided the labor. At the end of the harvest, the plantation owner would calculate the value of the crop against the cost of the supplies, the rent, and the food advanced throughout the year. The math was manipulated so that the farmer always came out owing money, legally chaining him to the land for another season. Leonard Chess did not invent this system. He simply modernized it for the music industry. He replaced the mule with a microphone, the cotton with a vinyl record, and the plantation store with his desk drawer. The most famous symbol of this urban sharecropping was the Cadillac. For a black man in 1950s America, a Cadillac was not just an automobile. It was the ultimate untouchable status symbol. It was a rolling fortress that commanded respect in a society that offered none. Leonard knew exactly what a Cadillac meant to the men on his roster. When an artist scored a massive hit on the rhythm and blues charts, Leonard would not hand them a royalty check reflecting their percentage of the sales. Instead, he would take them down to a local Chicago dealership, point to a gleaming, brand-new Cadillac Fleetwood, and hand them the keys. The musician would drive away feeling like a king, parading the vehicle down South Parkway, convinced he had finally conquered the world. He did not realize he was driving his own financial coffin. Leonard did not buy those cars out of his own profits. Every single dollar he spent on his artists, the Cadillacs, the bail money, the hospital bills, the cash handed out from the desk drawer for a new suit or a night out, was quietly and meticulously recorded in the company ledger. These were not gifts. They were advances against the artist's future royalties. But the trap went much deeper than personal expenses. Leonard charged the artists for the basic costs of running the record label. When Muddy Waters went into the studio, he was charged for the hourly rental of the room. He was charged for the wages of Willie Dixon and Fred Below to play on the track. When Leonard drove down south to bribe radio DJs with payola to get the record on the air, that bribe money was tallied up and charged against the artist's account. By the time all the personal advances and the manufactured production costs were calculated, the artist's account was buried in an inescapable mountain of debt. This was the phantom debt loop. No matter how many millions of records a chess artist sold, the ledger almost always showed them in the red. Because they technically owed the label money, Leonard never had to issue them a formal royalty payout. When they needed cash to survive, they had to walk back into his office, ask for another advance, and thereby deepen their own debt. To pay it off, they had to immediately return to the studio to record another track, and then hit the road for grueling, low-paying tours through the Chitlin circuit to generate immediate ticket sales. They were tethered to chess records for life, kept comfortable enough to keep producing, but deliberately denied the financial autonomy to walk away or build their own generational wealth. The tragedy of this system is perhaps best illustrated by the life of little Walter. Walter was a musical genius, a man who revolutionized the harmonica by amplifying it to sound like a distorted, wailing saxophone. But Walter was also a deeply traumatized, volatile young man. He drank heavily, carried a gun, and possessed a hair-trigger temper that constantly resulted in extreme violence. In a standard corporate environment, an employee exhibiting Walter's behavior would be fired or sent to a rehabilitation facility. Leonard Chess did neither. Walter's instrumental tracks were selling millions of copies, dominating the jukeboxes across the country. He was too profitable to fix, so Leonard enabled the self-destruction. When Walter got into a knife fight and was thrown in a jail cell, Leonard paid the bail, absorbed the cost into Walter's royalty account, and propped him up in front of a studio microphone the next day. Leonard's paternalism toward little Walter was not the care of a father for a son. It was the maintenance of a factory owner repairing a highly lucrative, broken machine. As long as Walter could draw breath through a harmonica, Leonard would shield him from the legal consequences of his actions. This toxic enablement stripped Walter of any accountability and accelerated his downward spiral. He became a prisoner of his own success and his boss's protection. Walter died at the age of 37, succumbing to injuries sustained in a street brawl, penniless, despite having written and performed some of the highest-selling blues records in history. Leonard justified this economic structure to himself through the lens of extreme entrepreneurial risk. In his mind, he was the one who had put up the capital to buy the building on South Michigan Avenue. He was the one risking federal prosecution by driving through Mississippi bribing radio stations. He was the one pressing the records and taking a chance on a demographic that white America had written off as worthless. Without him, he reasoned, these men would still be sweating on loading docks or picking cotton. He believed that the risk he absorbed entitled him to the absolute maximum return. The cash advances and the Cadillacs were, in his view, a generous accommodation for men who did not understand how to manage capital. The artists, for their part, were caught in a paralyzing cognitive dissonance. They knew on a visceral street level that the numbers did not add up. They knew that their songs were playing on every jukebox from Chicago to New Orleans, yet they were still asking Leonard for $50 to buy groceries. But confronting the Godfather was an impossible proposition. To challenge Leonard meant demanding an audit, which required hiring a white lawyer to navigate the white legal system, the very institution these men had spent their lives avoiding. Furthermore, challenging Leonard meant risking the destruction of the only safety net they had ever known. If they demanded a standard contract and Leonard cut them off, who would bail them out the next time the Chicago police decided to harass them? Who would pay the rent when the touring season dried up in the winter? They traded long-term wealth for short-term survival. The paternalistic system fed on their insecurity, transforming their brilliant artistic output into the bricks and mortar of Leonard Chess's growing fortune. Yet, the physical cash that Leonard kept from his artists through the phantom debt loop was only the tip of the iceberg. The withholding of record sales royalties was a street-level hustle. The true, devastating wealth transfer, the mechanism that would strip these men of their legacy and ensure they remained impoverished while their music generated tens of millions of dollars on a global scale, was being constructed entirely out of sight. The artists were focused on the cash in the desk drawer, completely unaware that they were signing away the very deeds to their souls on pieces of paper they could barely read. The true scale of Leonard Chess's financial empire rested on the fundamental difference between selling a physical object and owning an idea. In the music industry, there are two distinct streams of revenue. The first is the master recording, the physical piece of vinyl or shellac that a customer buys in a shop. The second, and infinitely more valuable, is the publishing right, the legal ownership of the underlying composition, the lyrics and the melody. Owning the master recording is like owning a single house. You can sell it once. Owning the publishing is like owning the land underneath the entire city. You collect rent from everyone who ever builds on it, walks across it, or broadcasts a picture of it. The artists at 2120 South Michigan Avenue were fighting for pennies from the sale of the physical houses. Leonard Chess was quietly buying the land beneath their feet. In 1953, Leonard formalized this wealth extraction by establishing a publishing company called Arc Music, partnering with two seasoned music industry operators, Gene and Harry Goodman. The creation of Arc Music was the most devastatingly effective business maneuver of Leonard's life. It transformed Chess Records from a successful regional independent label into a global intellectual property holding company. The mechanics of Arc Music were ruthlessly simple, weaponizing the desperation and the lack of legal education of the black artists who walked through the studio doors. When a songwriter like Willie Dixon or a performer like Sonny Boy Williamson walked into Leonard's office with a new song, they were usually motivated by immediate, pressing survival. They needed cash to pay rent, to buy groceries, or to keep the heat on in their South Side apartments. Leonard would listen to the track, nod, and pull $50 from his desk drawer. He would slide the cash across the desk alongside a standardized legal contract. To the artist, this was a straightforward transaction. They were being paid for a day's work, selling their performance of a song to a boss. But the document they were signing was not a receipt for a performance. It was a total, perpetual assignment of copyright. By signing that piece of paper, the artist legally surrendered all claims to the composition. They gave up the right to collect mechanical royalties when the song was pressed onto a record, and they gave up the performance royalties generated every time the song was played on the radio, performed in a concert, or used in a film. For a one-time payout of $30 or $50, Leonard Chess and Arc Music acquired the total ownership of songs that would define the 20th century. The willingness of brilliant men like Willie Dixon to sign these documents stemmed from the brutal realities of the Jim Crow era. The Jim Crow South had deliberately disenfranchised Black Americans, stripping them of access to quality education, legal literacy, and generational wealth. When these men migrated to Chicago, they did not suddenly acquire entertainment lawyers. The American legal system had only ever been a tool of oppression against them. The idea of using a contract to protect their own abstract intellectual property was an entirely foreign concept. Furthermore, in the early 1950s, blues music was considered a disposable, low-class commodity. A song was played on the jukebox for a few months and then forgotten. No one, not even the artists themselves, could foresee that these 12-bar blues progressions would become the classical music of a new global youth culture. The true devastation of the Arc Music setup did not become apparent until a decade later, when the seismic cultural shift known as the British invasion occurred. In the early 1960s, a generation of white, working-class teenagers in England discovered the imported, scratchy vinyl records of Chess artists. They were mesmerized by the danger, the sexuality, and the heavy electric groove of Chicago blues. These British kids formed bands, bought electric guitars, and began playing the music of Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Chuck Berry, when a young band from London decided to name themselves the Rolling Stones. Taking their name directly from a Muddy Waters song, they recorded cover versions of Willie Dixon's Little Red Rooster and Chuck Berry's Come On. When another English group called The Animals recorded The House of the Rising Sun, or when a newly formed Led Zeppelin began adapting Willie Dixon's You Need Love into their mega hit Whole Lotta Love, millions upon millions of dollars in publishing royalties were suddenly generated across the Atlantic. Where did this tsunami of wealth go? It did not go to the south side of Chicago to lift the original creators out of poverty. It went directly into the bank accounts of Ark Music. Because Leonard Chess held the copyrights, he and his partners collected the global licensing fees, the radio play royalties, and the mechanical payouts from every British rock album sold. The white British rock stars became millionaires. Leonard Chess became a multi-millionaire. The black men who had bled their trauma into those original lyrics were left playing for tips in smoky Chicago taverns, entirely cut out of the colossal financial harvest their own genius had sown. The psychological toll this system took on the artists was profound, but the reactions varied drastically depending on the internal constitution of the man. The dynamic between Leonard Chess and his two greatest titans, Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, provides a masterclass in the psychology of power, trauma, and resistance. Muddy Waters chose the path of the loyalist. Muddy was a man who deeply understood the violent, inescapable hierarchy of the Mississippi plantation. When he looked at Leonard Chess, he did not see a ruthless corporate executive. He saw a benevolent plantation owner who actually allowed his workers to eat at the big table. Muddy knew, on some level, that he was being financially exploited. He saw the mansions Leonard was buying in the suburbs while he remained in a modest city house. But Muddy's trauma dictated his perspective. Leonard had pulled him out of the mud. Leonard had put his face on album covers. Leonard had treated him with a level of interpersonal respect, drinking with him, cursing with him, inviting him into his office, that no white man in Mississippi would ever have offered a black sharecropper. Muddy chose gratitude over justice. He accepted the Cadillacs, he accepted the cash advances, and he accepted his role as the obedient eldest son of the Chess family. When other artists complained about the missing royalties, Muddy would defend Leonard, fiercely protecting the white man who had given him a platform. "They gave me this life," Muddy would say, a sentence that encapsulates the tragic, unbreakable trauma bond that paternalistic exploitation relies upon. Muddy preferred the predictable, managed exploitation of Leonard Chess over the terrifying, unnavigable hostility of the outside world. Howlin' Wolf, however, was a completely different species of man, and his relationship with Leonard Chess was a volatile, explosive war of attrition. Born Chester Burnett, Wolf stood over 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighed close to 300 pounds. He possessed a voice that sounded like heavy machinery grinding gravel. But what truly set Howlin' Wolf apart from his peers was not his physical intimidation, it was his mind. Unlike Muddy, Wolf had pursued an education. He had served in the military and learned how to read, write, and calculate basic accounting. He understood the value of a dollar, and he understood the mechanics of a contract. When Wolf arrived at Chess Records, he looked at Leonard's paternalistic ecosystem and flatly refused to participate. When Leonard offered to take Wolf to the dealership to buy him a brand new Cadillac, the standard trap used to ensnare the other artists in the phantom debt loop, Wolf sneered at the offer. He knew the car was not a gift. He walked down to a dealership himself, pulled a roll of his own cash from his pocket, and bought a practical Pontiac station wagon. He drove it back to the studio, a rolling declaration of his financial independence. Wolf was the only artist on the roster who consistently terrified Leonard Chess. In the recording studio, the balance of power shifted violently. If Leonard barked an order over the intercom, demanding Wolf change a lyric or pick up the tempo, Wolf would slam his guitar down, march into the control room, and curse Leonard out, towering over the record executive. Wolf demanded to see the accounting ledgers. He demanded to know exactly how many records were pressed and how many were shipped. He paid his own backing band out of his own pocket, ensuring they were loyal to him, not to the label. Leonard Chess hated Wolf's insubordination, but he was forced to respect it. He could not manipulate Wolf the way he manipulated Little Walter or Muddy Waters. Wolf forced Leonard into a highly uncomfortable position, dealing with a black man in the 1950s not as a dependent child, but as an adversarial, equal businessman. Their relationship was defined by mutual hostility and mutual profit. Wolf never allowed himself to be financially ruined by Ark Music to the extent of his peers, because he refused to sign away his publishing rights for a handful of pocket change, fighting fiercely for every cent he generated. If Muddy Waters was the loyal son and Howlin' Wolf was the rebellious adversary, Etta James was the surrogate daughter, representing yet another complex facet of Leonard's psychological control. Etta James came to Chess Records as a profoundly damaged young woman. She had been abandoned by her mother, raised by abusive surrogates, and was battling a severe, escalating heroin addiction. She was a raw, gaping wound of a human being, possessing a voice of such astonishing power and pain that it could shatter glass. When Etta walked into Leonard's life, she was desperate for the one thing she had never experienced, a protective father. Leonard stepped into that void perfectly. He took absolute control over her career and her personal life. He paid for her stints in rehabilitation clinics. He physically tracked her down in drug dens on the South Side, dragging her out, sobering her up, and forcing her into the vocal booth. He recognized that Etta's voice was too grand for the crude, distorted blues arrangements that defined the label's early years. Leonard spent vast sums of money bringing in lush string sections and sophisticated horn arrangements, molding Etta into a crossover pop and soul superstar with monumental hits like At Last. It is vital here to strip away the grotesque, romanticized fiction that Hollywood attached to this relationship. Decades later, the film Cadillac Records would portray a sexually charged, illicit romance between Leonard Chess and Etta James. This was a cinematic fabrication that deeply insulted the reality of both their lives. Etta James herself, in her memoirs, and Leonard's son, Marshall Chess, explicitly dismantled this myth. Their relationship was entirely devoid of romance. It was an extreme, intense, and deeply controlling father-daughter dynamic. Leonard controlled Etta by becoming the only reliable anchor in her chaotic existence. But this protection came at the ultimate price. Because Etta was constantly in debt due to her addiction and her rehabilitation costs, she was entirely at Leonard's mercy. She signed whatever he told her to sign. She surrendered her financial autonomy in exchange for the physical safety and the artistic direction he provided. Leonard saved her life, repeatedly, but he also ensured that he owned the rights to the voice he was saving. As the calendar turned toward the late 1960s, the impregnable fortress that Leonard Chess had built began to show fatal structural cracks. The world outside the walls of 2120 South Michigan Avenue was undergoing a violent, irreversible transformation. The civil rights movement was tearing down the legal framework of systemic racism. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 ignited riots that burned large sections of Chicago's South Side to the ground, destroying the old club circuits and the very neighborhoods that had birthed the Chess sound. More dangerously for Leonard's business model, a new generation of black artists and activists was rising. Men like James Brown and Sam Cooke were preaching financial empowerment and ownership of intellectual property. The younger musicians arriving in Chicago were not illiterate sharecroppers fleeing the Delta. They were educated, politically conscious, and deeply suspicious of white executives demanding they sign away their publishing rights for a new car. The era of paternalism was rapidly ending. The illusion of the Godfather was dissolving, leaving only the stark, undeniable mathematics of exploitation. Leonard Chess, sitting in his office, his health failing and his blood pressure rising, looked at the changing cultural landscape and realized a profound truth. The game he had mastered was over. The artists were waking up. The lawyers were circling. It was time to cash out before the empire collapsed under the weight of its own historical sins. The decision to dismantle an empire is rarely made in a single moment of clarity. It is usually forced by the relentless, grinding pressure of a changing world. By 1968, the world outside the reinforced doors of 2120 South Michigan Avenue had become unrecognizable to Leonard Chess. The cultural and economic tectonic plates of the United States were shifting violently, and the specific ecosystem that allowed a paternalistic street-level record label to thrive was rapidly collapsing. The music itself was changing. The black community in America, radicalized by the civil rights movement, the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and the escalating war in Vietnam, had moved on from the raw, acoustic-tinged agony of the Delta blues. The youth were tuning into the polished, militant soul of James Brown, the immaculate pop factory precision of Motown in Detroit, and the gritty, gospel-driven grooves of Stax in Memphis. The blues was suddenly viewed by many young, politically conscious black Americans as the soundtrack of submission, a painful relic of the sharecropping past they were desperately fighting to transcend. Ironically, the primary audience for Chess Records' back catalog had become white college students and European rock musicians. Furthermore, the business of music had modernized into a corporate behemoth. The era of driving a Cadillac through the South with a trunk full of shellac records and a pocket full of bribe money was over. The industry was now controlled by massive conglomerates, international distribution networks, and armies of entertainment lawyers. The young black artists coming into the industry were not illiterate migrants fleeing the Ku Klux Klan. They demanded fair contracts, standard royalty rates, and ownership of their publishing. The days of buying a man's life work for a $50 bill and a used car were extinct. Leonard Chess was not a nostalgic man. He did not possess a romantic attachment to the blues. He was a pragmatist who had built his wealth by reading the street, and the street was telling him that the game was finished. He was also exhausted. Decades of chain smoking, relentless travel, furious arguments with artists like Howlin' Wolf, and the constant stress of managing an underworld distribution network had ravaged his physical health. In January 1969, Leonard and Phil Chess made a calculated, ruthless business decision. They sold Chess Records, including its entire catalog of master recordings and its subsidiary publishing arms, to the General Recorded Tape (GRT) Corporation. The purchase price was $5 million, an astronomical sum for an independent label at the time, equivalent to tens of millions today. From a purely capitalistic perspective, Leonard had executed the ultimate American triumph. He had taken the survival instincts forged in a Polish ghetto and a Chicago scrapyard, weaponized them against a racist system, exploited the loopholes of intellectual property law, and cashed out at the absolute peak of his valuation. But for the artists who had built that valuation, the sale was a profound, world-shattering betrayal. When the news of the GRT acquisition broke, the illusion of the Chess family disintegrated instantly. Men like Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon, who had spent decades convincing themselves that Leonard was a protective father figure, suddenly woke up to the cold reality of corporate capitalism. They were not family members, they were not partners, they were assets on a balance sheet, sold along with the microphones, the mixing desks, and the pressing plants. The paternalistic bubble had burst. The new corporate owners at GRT did not operate out of a desk drawer. They were suits from California who knew nothing about the volatile, emotional management of blues musicians. If an artist needed bail money, GRT did not send an executive down to the police station. If an artist needed an advance to pay their heating bill, GRT directed them to the accounting department, who pulled out the contracts, pointed to the insurmountable phantom debt loop that Leonard had meticulously engineered, and denied the request. The buffer was gone. The artists were left exposed, tethered to a corporate machine that demanded product but offered zero protection. Leonard, however, did not stick around to manage the fallout. He took his millions and pivoted toward a new venture, purchasing the W-On radio station to consolidate his media influence in Chicago. He had successfully extracted himself from the messy, physical reality of the record business. But fate has a peculiar, often brutal sense of timing. Leonard Chess had spent his entire life running. He ran from Europe. He ran from the poverty of the South Side. He ran through the dangerous highways of the Jim Crow South, and he ran from the ethical consequences of his own business model. But he could not outrun his own biology. On the 16th of October, 1969, just 9 months after signing the paperwork that made him a multi-millionaire, Leonard Chess was driving his car through the streets of Chicago. He was heading to a doctor's appointment to address his worsening chest pains. He never made it. A massive heart attack struck him behind the wheel. The man who had orchestrated the soundtrack of the 20th century died abruptly on a Midwestern street at the age of 52. The shockwave of his death rippled through the music industry, but nowhere was the impact more violently felt than among the black musicians he left behind. The reaction was a complex, tangled web of grief, confusion, and lingering trauma. Muddy Waters, the man who had been the cornerstone of the empire, was devastated. Despite the undeniable financial exploitation, Muddy wept openly for the man he considered his savior. The psychological conditioning of the paternalistic system was so deep that even in death, Muddy mourned the loss of his exploiter as if he had lost a brother. But as the initial shock subsided and the 1970s began, the grief curdled into a harsh, glaring legal reckoning, with Leonard in the ground and the company in the hands of a faceless corporation. The fear of challenging the Godfather evaporated. The musicians, now aging and facing a steep decline in their touring revenues, were forced to look at their bank accounts. They saw British rock bands playing stadiums, flying in private jets, and earning millions of dollars by performing note-for-note covers of the songs written in the cramped studios of South Michigan Avenue. And they saw themselves struggling to survive on meager club gigs. The realization of the Ark Music publishing trap finally hit them with full force. They had not just been underpaid, they had been systematically robbed of their generational wealth. The 1970s became the era of the audit. The bluesmen, pushed to the brink of poverty, finally hired the entertainment lawyers they should have had 20 years earlier. Howlin' Wolf, who had always been the most suspicious and financially literate of the roster, was among the first to strike. He initiated legal proceedings against Ark Music and the remnants of the Chess empire, demanding an audit of the books and suing for $2.5 million in unpaid royalties. Wolf had spent years screaming at Leonard in the studio. Now his lawyers were screaming in federal court. But the most devastating legal assault came from the man who had actually written the architecture of the Chess sound. Willie Dixon. Dixon was the architect of the catalog. He had written Hoochie Coochie Man, Spoonful, Little Red Rooster, and hundreds of other foundational tracks. He had sold them to Leonard for pennies, believing the immediate cash was the only value the songs held. But when a British rock band called Led Zeppelin released a song called Whole Lotta Love, which was essentially a direct, uncredited adaptation of Dixon's You Need Love, and it sold millions of copies worldwide, the sheer scale of the theft could no longer be ignored. Willie Dixon did not just sue Led Zeppelin for copyright infringement. He turned his legal sights entirely on Ark Music. In 1977, Dixon and Muddy Waters joined forces to file a monumental lawsuit against the publishing company Leonard Chess had built. They accused the corporation of systemic fraud, withholding royalties, and operating a legally unconscionable business model designed to exploit their lack of legal representation. The lawsuit tore the veil off the romanticized myth of chess records. In the sterile, fluorescent light of a federal courtroom, there was no talk of family or benevolent Cadillacs. The lawyers dissected the contracts, the cash advances, and the phantom debt loops. They laid bare the precise mechanics of how Leonard Chess had taken the intellectual property of marginalized black men and funneled the profits into offshore accounts, real estate, and corporate dividends. The legal battle was grueling, forcing men in their 60s to fight for the rights to words they had written in their 30s. But this time, they had the leverage of a modernized legal system and undeniable proof of global sales. Arc Music, realizing that a public trial would expose decades of indefensible corporate fraud, was forced to capitulate. Willie Dixon and Muddy Waters won a resounding victory. They reached a massive out-of-court settlement that not only awarded them significant financial compensation for decades of stolen royalties, but, more importantly, forced Arc Music to return the copyrights of the songs back to their original creators. Dixon immediately established his own publishing company, the Hoochie Coochie Music Corporation, finally taking ownership of the land he had built upon. It was a triumph of justice, but it was a victory laced with bitter irony. By the time the rights were returned and the checks were cut, the prime earning years of the blues era were over. The men were old, their health was failing, and the millions of dollars that had flowed through the 1950s and 60s had already been spent by the executives who intercepted it. They had won back their legacy, but they could never win back the time, the security, or the peace of mind that Leonard Chess had stolen from them under the guise of friendship. As the dust settled on the lawsuits, and the physical building at 2120 South Michigan Avenue was abandoned and sold off, historians and musicologists were left to sift through the wreckage. The empire was dismantled, the founder was dead, and the artists were finally free from the contracts. But the question of how to judge the man at the center of the storm remained. The legal verdicts had been rendered, but the historical verdict on Leonard Chess was about to become one of the most fiercely debated subjects in the history of American music. The physical building at 2120 South Michigan Avenue still stands, but the heavy wooden desk with its drawer full of cash is long gone. The lawsuits of the 1970s eventually settled the legal disputes, returning the stolen copyrights to the men who bled them into existence. Yet, the historical trial of Leonard Chess remains unresolved. How does a society accurately judge a man who was simultaneously the savior of a marginalized culture and its most ruthless parasite? The argument for Leonard Chess is rooted in the harsh reality of mid-century America. Without his relentless ambition and aggressive street-level hustling, the Chicago blues might have never escaped the South Side. Major corporate labels were terrified of the black working class, dismissing the raw, electrified sound of Delta migrants as entirely unmarketable. Leonard waded directly into it. He took massive physical and financial risks, loading his Cadillac with shellac records and driving deep into the fiercely segregated Jim Crow South to bribe white DJs. He provided a sanctuary in a society that offered black men zero legal protection. From this perspective, he was the essential pragmatic architect who built the bridge for black music to conquer the world. But that defense crumbles under the weight of basic mathematics. The fatal flaw is the assumption that his risk justified his theft. Leonard provided the bridge, but he forced the artists to pay for the bricks and tolls while he alone kept the deed. His benevolence was a weaponized illusion. The bail money, rent checks, and gleaming Cadillacs were not acts of charity. They were the mechanisms of the phantom debt loop. He explicitly exploited the deep, generational trauma of his artists. Knowing they sought a protector, he used their vulnerability to secure their futures in exchange for immediate security. When he established Arc Music and bought total publishing rights to masterpieces for a few crumpled $50 bills, he committed one of the greatest intellectual property heists of the 20th century. He broke down racial barriers not for civil rights, but to expand his profit margin. Ultimately, his family inherited a multi-million-dollar empire, while the architects of rock and roll were forced into grueling lawsuits just to reclaim their own names. The uncomfortable truth is that in the machinery of American capitalism, the savior and the bloodsucker are very often the exact same person. Leonard Chess is the blueprint for the 20th century music industry, a system fueled by the unfiltered genius of the marginalized, yet owned by those with capital and legal knowledge. You cannot separate the greatness of Chess Records from the exploitation that funded it. However, to view these black musicians merely as passive victims strips them of their agency. Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, and Etta James were survivors of a profoundly brutal world. They walked into that studio knowing they were navigating a rigged game, but they played it because it was the only game in town. They used Leonard Chess's money and distribution network to document their existence, knowing the music would outlive the men who pressed it. In that regard, the artists achieved the ultimate victory. The phantom debt loops have been exposed, and the Cadillacs have rusted away. The hoarded wealth has been dispersed. When you drop a needle on a Chess record today, you do not hear the sound of exploitation. You hear the sharp slap of a snare drum, the wailing agony of a harmonica, and the booming voice of a man who survived the cotton fields to force the world to listen. The legacy of Chess Records does not belong to the executives who balance the ledgers. It belongs forever to the men and women who stood in the control room, opened their mouths, and sang the blues until the world changed.